Okay, so let's look at obesity then. 7 years ago, I was pre-diabetic and I was getting fatter, and I was eating skim milk, orange juice, porridge, blueberries, bananas, and active, running 3 times a week. And I was still putting on weight. And I really believed in the calories in and calories out. But when I looked at what I was eating, I now know. When I did my diabetic training, I certainly learned what was happening. I would wake up and my blood sugar would be up here. Like I said, this is just for illustrative purposes. And I would have that breakfast. I would have a breakfast that was quite high carb. And because it's not really species appropriate or specific, it's very processed. The orange juice it's just such a lot of sugar. There's no fruit there, obviously. It's just the sugar. Skim milk is pretty useless. The porridge, oats really push my blood glucose up and spike it. Now, the pancreas then produces insulin to bring the blood sugar down. And because it doesn't want a toxic level of blood glucose, it tends to bring it down quite dramatically. And you get that sugar crash after that sugar high. So then I'd have lunch and I would have a high carbohydrate meal, baked potato with beans or something like that. And again, I would push my blood sugar up a little bit too quickly. And then I would have insulin come out, and then I would have that crash. So I'd have a snack, and then my blood sugar would go up, and then I'd have a crash, then I'd have dinner, and that would go up, and then I'd go to sleep. And overnight, my liver would provide me with my blood glucose via gluconeogenesis. So that was a profile I didn't like. So just to recap what happens there. So I'm talking about glucose in the system through the digestive system, sometimes going to muscles, sometimes going to liver, but any excess going to fat storage. And the pancreas is in charge of this by releasing insulin. Insulin is a key player. So obesity can be caused by high blood sugar. But what about diabetes? Well, some people think diabetes is the lack of control of blood sugar, but that's just a symptom. And I've talked about this last week. It is a symptom. So if your blood sugar control is poor and your blood sugar is going up, well, that's telling you something's wrong. So it isn't necessarily that your blood sugar is high or too low, and we will talk about type 1. Some people think it's trouble with carbohydrate metabolism or carbohydrate toxicity, eating too many carbs. Some people don't produce enough insulin to get all that energy into the cells, and that is a type 1 diabetic. Their pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin. Some people have too much insulin. When I say too much, it possibly means the body has been producing a lot of insulin, and now the cells are resistant to that insulin, so it's not really working. So that's basically what we're explaining there. The right amount of insulin, but it doesn't work properly. And that's because the human cells all have what's called a membrane, or not all, but most have a membrane. And in that cell, you need to produce energy, and the cell membrane lets the energy in the form of glucose in this example. So the cell membrane is this bit here. So what's going to happen? Well, here we go. Insulin is coming in. It goes to a receptor down here. Once insulin is in that receptor, the glucose can go into the cell. That's it at its most basic. That's what insulin does. It makes the cell receptive. But I want to go back to that person who was listening, maybe who was thinking, well, I'll get a blood glucose monitor. That will be all I need. Well, actually, this is what happens because we have a lot of data. Some people can be having their blood glucose looking fine for years, actually 10 to 15 years. But they've not been measuring their insulin. But when you look at the insulin in the background, that's been going up and up in the background. So now what we should be doing, if we had the money to do this, to be honest, we should be measuring blood glucose and also looking at insulin, because we can see from this graph that this person in 1974, the insulin matched the blood glucose. And this looked fine, the blood glucose, up until about 1998. But in the background, the insulin was rising. And in 1984, we could have said, oh, hang on a minute, there's so much insulin now being produced. What's going on? And what we would guess from that, what we would speculate is this person is becoming insulin resistant and they're needing more and more insulin. And there is a tipping point where the insulin production is just too hard for the pancreas and it starts to drop off. And obviously, as that drops off and the insulin resistance gets worse, the blood glucose control gets worse and worse. And then you start having to look at medications. A healthy person will have a pancreas here that produces insulin. It goes into the receptor and that allows glucose into the cell. That's what it looks like. A type 1 will have a small amount of insulin, so it can't really do its job. And then a type 2 diabetic would have a lot of insulin, but the insulin receptor has started to not work so well, so you still can't get glucose into the cell. So this situation is the interesting one, where you could be eating tons of food and therefore thinking you have lots and lots of energy. The type 2 diabetic will think they have lots and lots of energy available, but feel really sluggish. And that's because the energy isn't getting into the cell. And you will find that spiral of wanting to eat more and more and more. So going back to calories and setting fire to it in a bomb calorimeter doesn't explain this at all, because a type 2 diabetic can have lots and lots of energy but not be able to access it. And a type 1 diabetic, if we go back to that, the type 1 diabetic can eat absolutely tons and tons, but there's so little insulin and so little glucose going into the cell, they actually waste away because insulin is used for other things as well, and they can't even gain any weight. So that sort of defeats the object of calories as well. So let's move on. So the advice to eat little and often doesn't seem to work, because you end up with this awful situation of sugar spikes and sugar crashes. And the more you snack, the more that can really work. And this isn't looking at blood glucose. This is looking at what happens to insulin. So the good level of insulin is atrocious. The spikes are really, really pronounced if you eat little and often, and it's high carbohydrate. So you don't want high levels of insulin. This is just for illustrative purposes, the equivalent of teaspoons of sugar in a healthy breakfast, because this is the breakfast I used to eat. So I would have 27 teaspoons of sugar in the morning, because I had porridge, skim milk, a little bit of maple syrup, some blueberries, a banana, and an orange juice. And that's the equivalent of 27 teaspoons. And with the banana, for instance, there's a little bit of another thing in play there, because obviously you've got some fructose, and fructose doesn't show up on a blood glucose monitor because it's a blood glucose monitor, not a fructose monitor, and that's going to be metabolized in the liver. So I had a bit of a double whammy there. And this is a keto type breakfast: scrambled egg, avocado, bacon, and coffee with cream. And the equivalent teaspoon of sugar that breakfast is 1 teaspoon of sugar. So that's why we say try and avoid the carbohydrates if you can. And this, if you're interested, this is what's called an insulin index. It's very unusual to see this. Not many people talk about it. And it shows you how insulin reacts to certain foods. So the best reaction you get is from butter on a scale of 1 to 160 here. Butter is a 2, an egg yolk, for instance, 16, picking things at random. Bacon is 9, banana is 84, and potatoes are 121. White bread is 100. Sweetened yogurt is 115. So you get a lot of insulin from some of these things. So it makes no sense to have lots and lots of meals, and it makes no sense to keep raising insulin, because that will increase your fat storage. When you start carnivore, a lot of people do 3 meals a day and then reduce and reduce. But the beauty of that is if you have low carbohydrate meal, you're going to not spike your insulin, you're not going to have an issue with fat storage, and you're going to keep your blood glucose nice and smooth. And if you do look at your blood glucose, you will see a nice smooth chart like that. And then we'll come on to fasting. So another way to keep blood glucose levels low and to keep levels of insulin low is to not eat. And this also means that you will keep your fat storage hormone not working, because you don't need insulin really that much when you're not eating. So you won't be storing fat, you'll be burning fat. And that's a simple process of fasting. And obviously it makes total sense. It's not going to raise your blood glucose. It's not going to raise your insulin. And for those that like to know a little bit more about what happens hour by hour, after 12 hours, you're not optimal for fat burning, but you have kept the insulin low for 12 hours. You've kept the blood glucose low for 12 hours. So that's a good state to be in. By about 16 hours, you're getting into the fasted state. Human growth hormones are rising. We talked about that, how that protects your muscle. And when you're not eating, it isn't about growing muscle, but it maintains the muscle mass. After 18 hours, it looks like most people start to burn fat. And obviously 24 hours, it gets into really serious fat burning. So coming to the end, and then I'll look at your chat and look at the questions. But the idea here is to just show you, this is known, it's not controversial when people talk about calories in, calories out, and other people talk about hormones. This is the book I had to study when I did my diabetes and obesity qualifications. Guyton's medical physiology textbook, and there it says insulin inhibits the action of hormone sensitive lipase. And basically the second point there, insulin promotes glucose transport into the fat cells exactly the same way it promotes glucose transport into muscle cells. But the kicker is this bit: all aspects of fat metabolism are greatly enhanced in the absence of insulin. So increased metabolic use of fat caused by insulin lack. So it's known. And this book is dotted with loads and loads of entries about insulin and how it impacts fat metabolism and fat burning.